From presidents and kings to aviators and explorers, to wear Russells is to join a fraternity of the most interesting individuals in the world. Since 1898, we've been in the same small town of Berlin, Wisconsin, making boots by hand. The process starts in our cutting room, where our cutters Ace and Ron will choose the material for each individual order from our storage racks, and then choose where to place each of the templates and patterns to make that pair of boots. Sometimes this could be multiple different materials depending on the type of model, but in most cases it's a single leather. About 97% of our cutting is done completely by hand in the same way that it's been done for centuries.
The cutter is basically the first person that has anything to do with a boot or a shoe. About 96%, 97% of what we do is hand cut, and then your finishing work is done on the hydraulic behind me. It's all die cut then.
Once each of the parts and pieces have been cut, they make their way as a bundle over to our split, stamp, and skive area. This is where we actually prep each of the materials for the rest of the process. Skiving is similar to splitting or thinning a material, but it does so just on the edge. Here you can see Ron, our splitter, going through and adjusting the splitting on each of the edges to make sure that it's the right thickness. This is really important because if any of the edges are too thick, then it becomes bulky and can provide a pinch point on the boot while you're wearing it. Each of the models are stamped with the individual order number to ensure that the parts and pieces don't get separated throughout the process. At any one time, we can have hundreds of pairs at different parts of the process, and so it's very important to ensure that they don't get mixed up. Once the packet is assembled, it gets delivered to our assembly department, which is our sewing room. Sherry here is sewing one of our inner vamps, prepping each of the different parts and pieces so that it makes it easier later on. Because of the complicated nature of our production process and the fact that nobody else produces a boot in the same construction method, we have to figure out different machines over a period of many decades to serve these different tasks. This is a furrier machine sewing the inner vamps, which will then get wet lasted and form the interior of the backcountry boot. The all-important label gets sewn in, and slowly the parts and pieces take shape into the shell of the boot. In the early days of Russell Moccasin, we produced both stitch down, welted, and moccasin construction. But over the years, our specialty in moccasin construction has outshined all the rest of our different construction methods, and that's pretty much all we practice today. What's really incredible about every pair of Russell Moccasin boots is that it is completely different than any other form of construction known anywhere in the world. It was developed right here at Russell in the early 1900s, with many of our patents coming around 1910. And that process has allowed us to differentiate ourselves both in performance and in style for the last century. A Russell Moccasin differs from stitch down or welted because not only is it molded from the bottom up rather than the top down, meaning that you're standing on the whole quarters, which eliminates any ability for a blowout on the sides, but also that moccasin construction hugs the bottom of your foot in an ergonomic way that is not possible with any other form of construction. But further, and more complicated than that, Russells are often 2 or 3 layers of leather wrapped individually around the foot that form sort of like Russian dolls nesting in one another. This construction is incredibly tedious because it's like painting yourself into a corner on purpose. Every step, you're making it more difficult for the next step, but the end result is that you have a shingle-like construction that shields the foot from water, abrasion, and protects it while still allowing your foot to have the ground feel, the stability, and the comfort that is only possible with this construction. Here, as we sew the backstay and put on the bindings, each of these parts and pieces would normally be done all at once before a boot was made in a stitch down or welted construction. But in a true moccasin construction, and particularly in a Russell Moccasin construction, Each of these parts and pieces have to be done individually, often going from our sewing room to our shoemakers, then back to the sewing room and back to the shoemakers in a process swinging from one room to the other that is unlike any other boot or shoe process in the world. The amount of time it takes to sew each of these different parts and pieces separately and then to join them at very specific intervals in the production process requires a lot of expertise and skill that you can only find here at our workshop. Because these practices have been developed over the last 100 years, many of our machines are also a similar age. We use a lot of Puritan sewing machines from the late 1800s, using either a single or double needle and actually a waxed glue that goes into each of the seams. This is a chain stitch machine, which means that it's different than a lock stitch, where it allows the seam to move more freely in areas where there's going to be a lot of flexing in the boot, which is really important for areas like the quarters and the backstay, and then here on the gusset. As the quarters come together on this pair of backcountry boots, you can start to see the initial shape take place of our moccasin construction. It's incredible to me that people don't understand what goes into this sort of process, that they think that it can all happen at once. But in reality, as we're making a pair of Russells, it goes from room to our shoemakers, back to our sewing department, then back to our shoemakers, and the sort of pendulum swing between our different departments where it ends up getting touched by nearly every single pair of hands in our entire workshop. And I call it a workshop and not a factory because, as you can see, there's no assembly line, there's no automation. Every part, process, and technique is done completely by eye and by hand and by feel in a way that can only be done by many thousands of repetitions, learning this by feel and by eye. That's what makes a Russell moccasin incredibly special on the foot and to the eye, is the incredible uniqueness, not only of the boot from other boots in the world, but also just among other Russell moccasins. That because of the natural materials and because of the immense amount of handwork that goes into each pair, there's a constant slight difference between every single pair that we produce at Russell Moccasin. This individuality is part of what makes Russell so special. We look at each of the different slight differences as a signature of the people who made it, the hands that went into making each part. As the boot travels from room to room, from our machine sewing room now to our shoemaker room, it gets touched by a different set of hands who will actually start forming the boot into its final shape. The shell of the boot, now assembled by the machine sewing department, gets wet lasted, and the heel counter gets lasted separately. By lasting the heel counter separately, this allows the heel counter to take that form without having to do so on the foot, which means that there's not any squeaking, there's not any discomfort from the first wear. And that's one of the things that people tell me all the time when they put on a pair of Russells for the first time, is that they couldn't believe an all-leather boot could feel this good from day one. And that's because we pre-form all of those different materials and parts and pieces individually to ensure that by the time it gets on your foot, it's as close as possible to the shape of your foot. And then over time, each of those parts and pieces will mold to your foot for a more custom fit. Here, Ron will actually start taking and pulling up the different parts of the boot. And you can see why this can't be done all at once, because the bottom is completely sealed off from the top. It has to be lasted here at the heel to close off the heel around the heel counter. Once the heel counter is put in permanently, it'll go on through the rest of the process of actually forming up the toe shape later in the same shoemaker room. This is what we call the pullover process. It's the initial stages of forming the boot to start taking that shape. This finished shell will be left dry for about 48 hours. And once it's dried, we pull out the tacks, pull out the last that it's been formed around. The heel gets a little bit of cork underneath the void where the heel has been lasted. And then we produce the midsole. Because of our unique construction, we have to produce many of the components internally for the boot. So typically, heel counters are pre-formed. We actually form those by hand in our shop here. Typically, midsoles are pre-cut. We have to cut those and shape those here at our shop to ensure a custom fit for each of the different sizes. This ability to produce everything in-house is part of what makes Russell so impervious to the times. We've survived now 2 different pandemics, several different world wars, and countless other impediments to our success, and still we've remained, largely because of our independence and our self-sufficiency from the rest of the industry and the rest of the world. It's not that we don't innovate, we innovate all the time. We're always coming up with new ways to make our boots better. But we have a high degree of respect and tradition here of an immense amount of success, both in the field and in craftsmanship, that gives us a great foundation that we really don't have to deviate that far from. As the lasts are being pulled out of the shell, you'll see the basic form of the boot start to take shape. That leather that was once completely flat on the side of an animal is now being formed into a completely different shape that will eventually be like a leather sock around the foot. This antique Model D machine is what we use to put in the Blake stitches that go through the outermost layer of the boot, the vamp, and into the midsole. It's an incredibly complicated machine that stands about 7 foot tall. And it's one of the specialized machines that make the product that we produce capable of withstanding the amount of force it needs in the field. There's no nails holding the boot together. These stitches are able to flex underneath your foot as you're in the field, which provides an immense amount of structure and stability. Once the midsole is Blake stitched down to the vamp, we take that inner vamp that Sherry sewed earlier, that's now been wet lasted and formed to the last, and we prep that to be permanently placed on the inside of the boot. You can see here that our heel counter is even stitched to the midsole to ensure that there's no movement between the heel counter and the rest of the boot. As Ron glues up the bottom, he'll prep the sides, ensuring that there's an even coverage. And then that Russianistic doll nesting starts to take place as he places in the inner vamp and starts to last it in place again. The inner vamp is an incredible technology that was developed in the early 1900s here at Russell. It only exists here, and what's special about it is it provides a waterproof layer inside the boot, like a sock, that completely seals out the exterior seams. Like shingles on a roof, the seams are opposite and opposed to any exterior seams, which makes it very difficult for water to make its way into the interior of the boot. Once the inner vamp is allowed to dry for about 48 hours, it goes on to the next step of the process. Ron takes out the different tacks that were holding the boot in place around the form of the inner vamp and prepares it to be permanently put in place. The inner vamp must be sewn and glued to ensure that it stays in properly. This interior lining is unlike a regular lining because it has no seams that are the same as the exterior, which provides a level of comfort that is only attainable with this sort of construction. Once the inner vamp is permanently put in place with the glue, the last is pulled out, leaving the inner vamp permanently into the interior of the boot. It moves back to our machine sewing room where it gets hand trimmed to match the exterior so that all the seams line up perfectly. As you can see, with all the stretching and movement of all the different layers, this can't be done pre-punched at the beginning. It has to be done per each boot because every leather is going to react differently. And now we sew in the inner vamp permanently. So this is a seam that goes around the entire boot, and it permanently places the inner vamp in there in a structural way in addition to the adhesive that we've already put on the inside of the boot. This seam line allows it to be trimmed so that there's a smooth transition as your foot slides into the boot. The quarters get peeled back like layers on an onion, and it goes back to the shoemaker room for everything to be trimmed. From here, the process of actually forming the rest of the boot takes place. The gusset that was never put on in the beginning like a normal boot now has to be put on once everything else has been sewn into place. Typically, this process would have been done at the very, very beginning on any sort of stitch down or welted construction. But in our construction, it has to be done near the end, because otherwise you would not have been able to get to the inner vamp or the interior parts of the boot. Those have been left open until now so that we can actually access those and do the interior work necessary to put the inner vamp in. It's incredibly tedious to do these sewing lines because the boot's not flat, it's not just the shell, it's actually formed into a very close approximation of what that final shape will be. And so you're sewing a 3D object. Next we use a Model C to put in the eyelets. There's different spacing on a Russell from over the instep to up the leg, and that's for a reason. The fit of a Russell, being from the underside of the foot up, needs more structure, it needs more lacing right over the top of the foot, around the waist of the foot. It's almost, as I explain it to people when I'm fitting people, it's like a belt that sits around your midfoot from underneath your arch over the top of your foot, and that's where the structure and fit of a Russell is. What this allows the foot to do is it holds onto your midfoot and heel and not the forefoot, allowing the forefoot to be free for flexibility, for stability, to actually be able to articulate the metatarsals in your foot and be able to feel the ground. It allows you on rough terrain to actually be able to side hill and use your foot's mechanics to enhance your grip and stability in rough terrain. That's only available and capable in a moccasin construction, because otherwise the structure of the bottom of the boot would impede your foot from actually having that ability. It now makes its way back over to the shoemaker room, where our experienced shoemakers take and hand stitch the Russell overlap seam. This seam was developed and patented by Teofil Lutinsky in 1910 at Russell Moccasin, and it's one of the most iconic parts of our process. It takes 2 to 3 years to become proficient in doing the stitch, and even a master Russell shoemaker takes on average 2 hours to sew a pair of Russell boots or shoes with this seam. Every seam is hand cut by eye to create that classic Russell toe shape, and then each stitch is made blind as the shoemaker takes the toe piece, the awl through the toe piece, catching the vamp, and then back to the toe piece without piercing that inner vamp that we placed in earlier. This process, the depth of the awl, the shape of the stitch, requires an incredible amount of patience and attention to detail. The Russell shoemaker is at the heart of everything they do because they give the heart and soul to every boot and shoe. Yi and other of our shoemakers have been with us for many decades, some even spanning up over 50 years. This longevity, this continuity has allowed us to take this craft and pass it from shoemaker to shoemaker for over 100 years.
The most exciting for me is actually getting to the part where we start sewing on top of the shoe. That hand sewing, it's just, to me, I just find it like an artwork, and that's why I liked it so much, because you're there, you're making your own. Everybody has their different hand sewing. Even though it looks like we're all doing the same thing, it really looks different just because we all space it differently, we all tighten it differently, and that's where we start seeing a lot of the artwork from. Because yeah, it's, over 100 years old, and we're still doing the same thing, and like it's great just to be here with that quality.
By the time it leaves the shoemaker room for the final time, it's already has everything that makes it a Russell Moccasin. What's incredible about our construction is that the upper and the lower of the outsole is completely separate and independent. I liken it to body-on-frame construction in vehicles where the chassis is completely separated from the cab and the upper parts of the vehicle. This separated construction allows an incredible degree of serviceability over time, as it allows us to isolate out the outsole and the midsole from the upper of the boot. I often tell people if you were to cut off the midsole, a Russell Moccasin would still be a functional boot or shoe. Each boot has a different outsole construction depending on the layers that are required, the flexibility required for the end purpose. But on a Russell Moccasin backcountry, we use what is called a double stack midsole, where we take that leather midsole that's already been applied in our sewing room and we put on a rubber liner, and that liner becomes a resoling surface for future resoles. It's an extra step, but it's a step that ensures that in the decades to come, as this boot is worn, we've ensured that it can be resoled as long as that boot is functional. As the edge gets pressed, it then goes on for a Goodyear edge stitch, and then the outsole will be placed on the bottom of that. This construction method is incredibly simple and it allows it to be serviced anywhere in the world by a local cobbler. We have many customers who resole their boots 5-6 times in the course of as many decades. And it's one of the things that makes Russells last so long. In fact, I think that we can say with relative confidence that Russell Moccasins are the longest lasting footwear in America. It's very common for our customers to get over 25 years, with pairs 50, 60, and even 70 years old being not uncommon at all. With the Goodyear edge stitch being done in the Landis machine, the surface is now prepped and ready for the outsole to be applied. It's an incredibly simple process, but with many simple processes, it takes time to do it this way. As the sole and the different components are heated up, they're then pressed together at the perfect temperature to allow that binding to occur. As the edges are sanded, we're looking for small imperfections in the sides, making sure that everything is cleaned up so that your foot looks correct when you look down at your boots. As the boot makes its way to the inspection room, the final details of a pair of Russell Moccasins are put into place, including the lacing studs, the conditioning, and any final quality control details. Every boot gets a different conditioning regimen, but on the midsole, we polish and seal the edges of the oak bark leather to ensure that it's sealed from water and other elements that you're going to encounter in the field. This particular leather, our famous walnut timberjack leather tanned at SB Foot in Minnesota, we often condition with Obenoffs, and this preconditioning before it goes to the customer ensures that when a customer gets our boots, it's perfectly ready to go directly into the field. When we close the box on a pair of Russells, we know they will be part of making history. Now, we could talk for hours about the world history and the American history that's been made in Russell Moccasins, and the fact that we have 3 pairs in the Smithsonian museums. But what's more important to us is your history. The time spent in the field with family and friends, the time spent in the outdoors enjoying the natural resources we've been granted. And it's that love of the natural resources, our land, our water, and our wildlife, that's part of our ethos at Russell Moccasin. Many of our craftsmen are sportsmen, and certainly our ownership are sportsmen and outdoorsmen. And this combination of being craftsmen and being outdoorsmen leads us to a unique position in the way that we think about the boots that we make. We believe in what we call conservation through craftsmanship. And it's a simple notion that as we make our boots and we are preparing them for many decades of service, as we're ensuring that they're able to be serviced and maintained over time, that inevitable issues like a skipped stitch or a sole that needs to be replaced, that those things can be repaired so that boot can be kept in service for as long as physically possible. That those things that we're doing on the front end, which take more time, they take more labor, they take more money to produce a boot in this way, that ultimately The end result is a proactive conservation of materials, of labor, of energy, everything that goes into making a pair of boots. And that the longer that we can keep those boots in service, the fewer resources that have ultimately been used to make it, effectively replacing what would have been 10 or 15 or even 20 pairs of a lesser pair of boots. Our belief of conservation through craftsmanship allows our boots to be used and perform around the world in extreme conditions. It's what drives us to make boots, and it's what we hope drives you to make history.